The moment my wife smiled and said the baby was mine, I realized our marriage had already ended. Emily stood in the doorway with a sun-kissed glow that hadn't been there before she left for her week-long vacation in Florida. She rolled a large suitcase across the hardwood floor of our foyer, dropped her purse onto the entry table, and looked at me with a smile that seemed carefully rehearsed. I had imagined this moment many times while she was away. I thought we might finally talk honestly about the distance growing between us over the past several months. Instead, she rested one hand gently on her stomach and said the words that changed everything. "Nathan, I'm pregnant." For a second, I simply stared at her. The clock above the fireplace ticked loudly in the silence between us. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past our neighborhood, and somewhere down the street a lawn mower hummed beneath the summer sun. Everything around me felt strangely ordinary, while my entire world quietly shifted beneath my feet. Emily waited for my reaction, her smile fading just enough to reveal uncertainty. Then she took another step toward me. "It's yours," she added softly, as if that settled every question before it could even be asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I was shocked by the pregnancy itself, but because deep inside I already knew something she either hadn't considered or hoped I had forgotten. Our marriage had not been a real marriage for a long time. We had spent months living like polite roommates sharing a mortgage instead of a husband and wife sharing a life. There were conversations that ended before they began, dinners eaten in silence, weekends spent in separate rooms pretending work or television mattered more than the growing emptiness between us. We hadn't rebuilt the closeness we once had despite every attempt I made. Counseling had become another canceled appointment on Emily's calendar. Weekend trips were postponed. Date nights quietly disappeared. Every effort I made seemed to dissolve into another excuse about deadlines, stress, or needing space. I watched her set her suitcase beside the staircase as if she expected me to walk over, hug her, and celebrate the announcement. Instead, I noticed little things that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. A brand new designer handbag she hadn't owned before leaving. A bracelet I had never seen. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering on her jacket, instead of the floral fragrance she always wore. They were tiny details, meaningless on their own, yet together they formed a picture that refused to leave my mind. "Say something," she whispered. I folded my arms and met her eyes. "When did you find out?" I asked calmly. She hesitated for barely a heartbeat before answering. "A few days ago." Another silence settled between us. She searched my face, perhaps expecting anger or confusion. Instead, I simply nodded once. Years of managing construction projects had taught me one lesson above all others. When something doesn't add up, emotions only cloud the numbers. Facts tell the truth. Feelings often don't. Emily stepped closer and reached for my hand, but I quietly stepped aside. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the first honest decision I'd made in months. "Nathan," she said, forcing another smile, "this changes everything." I looked at the wedding photo hanging on the wall behind her. Two people laughing beneath an October sky, believing promises alone could carry a lifetime. I barely recognized them anymore. "You're right," I answered. "It changes everything." She seemed relieved by those words, almost grateful. She mistook my calmness for acceptance. She had no idea that my silence came from certainty rather than surrender. I wasn't planning an argument. I wasn't interested in accusations or dramatic scenes. If there was a truth buried beneath her story, I would uncover it one piece at a time. I had built entire buildings by trusting measurements instead of assumptions, and I intended to approach my own marriage the same way. Before sunset that evening, while Emily unpacked upstairs and hummed as though life had suddenly become hopeful again, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad, wrote down every date I could remember from the previous 6 months, and drew a single line across the top of the page. That timeline would become the beginning of the end, although neither of us knew it yet. I barely slept that night. Emily fell asleep quickly, or at least she pretended to. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the last several months in my mind with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. It was amazing how many details suddenly found their proper place once I stopped making excuses for them. 3 months earlier, our home had still looked the same on the outside. Every Saturday morning, I made coffee while Emily watered the flowers on the front porch. We smiled at the neighbors, attended birthday parties, and posted cheerful vacation photos from the previous year. Anyone looking in from the outside would have called us a happy couple. They would have been completely wrong. The change had not happened overnight. It arrived quietly, almost politely. Emily began working later than usual, explaining that a new client required extra attention. She started carrying her phone everywhere, even walking into another room whenever it rang. At dinner, she often seemed distracted, replying with short answers before checking another notification. I convinced myself that every marriage experienced seasons like this. I believed patience was stronger than suspicion. Looking back, I realized patience can become denial if it lasts too long. I suggested we spend a weekend together in the mountains like we used to every fall. She said work was too busy. I bought tickets for a baseball game because she had always loved spending warm evenings at the stadium. She forgot the date. I reserved a table at the little Italian restaurant where I proposed to her 8 years earlier. An hour before dinner she called and said she was exhausted and wanted to stay home. I picked up takeout anyway and ate alone in the kitchen while she remained upstairs saying she had conference calls. Every disappointment seemed small enough to forgive by itself. Together they slowly built a wall between us. Even our conversations changed. We stopped talking about dreams and started discussing utility bills, grocery lists, and whose turn it was to take the car in for maintenance. The silence became familiar instead of uncomfortable, which was somehow even worse. My younger sister Olivia noticed it before I did. One Sunday afternoon, she invited us over for a backyard barbecue. On the drive home, she called me. "Nathan, are you two all right?" she asked gently. I laughed it off and blamed work stress. She did not argue, but I could hear that she was not convinced. A few weeks later, Emily announced she needed a vacation with several friends from work. She said everyone needed a break from deadlines and endless meetings. I encouraged her to go because I honestly believed time apart might help us appreciate each other again. I even drove her to the airport before sunrise. She kissed my cheek, thanked me for understanding, and disappeared through the security checkpoint without looking back. During that week, I expected messages about beaches, restaurants, and sightseeing. Instead, the communication became strangely inconsistent. Sometimes an entire day passed before she replied to a simple text. When she finally answered, the messages were unusually brief. One evening, she claimed she was already asleep by 9 o'clock. Yet an hour later, I noticed a photograph posted from an account belonging to someone in her travel group. The picture showed several people enjoying live music well after 10. Emily was standing near the edge of the crowd wearing the same blue dress she packed before leaving. I almost mentioned it when she came home, but something stopped me. It was not fear. It was instinct. I wanted facts before questions. That quiet decision now echoed through my mind as the first light of morning slipped through our bedroom curtains. Emily was still asleep beside me, breathing peacefully, while downstairs my legal pad waited on the kitchen table. I walked quietly into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and added another date to the timeline. I still did not know the whole story, but for the first time in months, I stopped trying to protect the marriage from uncomfortable truths. I decided I would simply follow the facts wherever they led. The next few days settled into a routine that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside, yet every conversation felt carefully rehearsed. Emily suddenly became warmer than she had been in months. She made breakfast before I left for work, asked about my projects, and even suggested that we spend more time together once everything settled down. If I had not lived through the previous 6 months, I might have believed she was simply excited about a new chapter in our lives. Instead, every kind word only made me wonder why the change had arrived so suddenly. I did not confront her. I simply watched. Years of supervising construction sites had taught me that the smallest crack often revealed the biggest structural problem. One evening while Emily was taking a shower, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I had never made a habit of checking her messages, and I still refused to invade her privacy without reason. What caught my attention was not the notification itself, but the name displayed on the screen. It was saved only as the letter A followed by a blue heart. The message disappeared before I could read more than a few words, but I noticed one sentence. "I hope everything goes according to plan." My stomach tightened. There could have been a perfectly innocent explanation, yet something about those words stayed with me long after the screen went dark. The following afternoon, I stopped by my bank during lunch to review several financial documents. Emily had recently mentioned that we should combine a few remaining personal accounts into one family account because, as she explained, preparing for a baby meant simplifying our finances. The timing seemed unusual. She had never shown much interest in our banking arrangements before. I politely thanked the advisor, requested printed statements for the past year, and took them home without mentioning the visit. That evening, Emily placed brochures across the dining room table. They showed larger houses in newer neighborhoods with spacious backyards and excellent school districts. She smiled as though the decision had already been made. A growing family needs more space, she said. We should start looking now before prices go even higher. I slowly flipped through the pages. Every property was considerably more expensive than our current home. That would be a big financial step, I replied. It is worth it for our future, she answered without hesitation. I looked at her for a long moment. It struck me that we had not repaired our marriage, had not rebuilt trust, had not even discussed why we had grown so far apart. Yet she was already planning the next 20 years. The order of events felt strangely backward. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from Olivia. She asked if we could meet for coffee after work. We sat outside a small cafe near the river where we had often met after college. She stirred her coffee quietly before speaking. Nathan, I almost did not bring this up, she admitted. I figured it was probably nothing, but I think you should know anyway. I listened without interrupting. About 2 weeks ago, one of my coworkers posted pictures from a resort in Florida. I recognized Emily in the background of one photo. I nodded. She was there with friends. Olivia hesitated before continuing. She was not standing with a group of women. She was sitting with a man around her age. Maybe they were just talking. I honestly do not know. I just thought it looked closer than coworkers usually look. She immediately apologized, saying she did not want to create problems based on assumptions. I thanked her for telling me the truth instead of protecting my feelings. As I drove home that evening, I did not feel angry. I felt focused. Olivia had not given me proof. She had simply handed me another piece of a puzzle that continued to grow clearer. When I walked through the front door, Emily greeted me with an enthusiastic smile and another stack of paperwork waiting on the kitchen island. I have been researching family financial planning, she said cheerfully. There are a few documents we should probably sign soon. I glanced at the folders without opening them. Then I looked directly into her eyes. She smiled with complete confidence, believing I was still several steps behind her. What she did not realize was that I had stopped listening to promises. From that moment forward, I trusted only timelines, records, and facts, and every new detail seemed to point in the same direction. Over the next week, I made no sudden moves. Emily seemed almost disappointed that I had not questioned her story. Instead of pressing me into an argument, she became increasingly eager to discuss our future. Every evening, she arrived home with another idea. One night, it was a larger vehicle. The next night, it was a list of neighborhoods with highly rated schools. Then it became life insurance policies and investment accounts. She spoke with remarkable confidence, as though every decision had already been made and my role was simply to agree. I nodded politely, asked practical questions, and quietly placed every brochure and document into a folder after she went to bed. My timeline was growing thicker by the day. The more I listened, the more I noticed that Emily rarely talked about rebuilding our relationship. She talked about finances, paperwork, and long-term commitments. It was as if our marriage itself had become secondary to the plans she wanted me to approve. One Saturday morning, she slid several documents across the kitchen island while I was making coffee. We should update the beneficiary information on a few accounts, she said with an easy smile. It is just responsible planning. I looked at the papers without touching a pen. There is no rush, I replied. Her smile remained, but I caught a brief flash of disappointment before she recovered. I just thought it would be easier to get everything organized early. I thanked her, folded the papers neatly, and placed them back into the envelope. That afternoon, I drove to my office even though it was the weekend. My closest colleague, Marcus, happened to be there reviewing blueprints before a Monday meeting. We had worked together for more than a decade, and I trusted his judgment because he never rushed to conclusions. Without mentioning the pregnancy, I asked him a simple question. Have you ever noticed how people suddenly become very persuasive when they need you to make a quick decision? Marcus smiled knowingly. If someone tells you that you must decide immediately, the first thing you should do is slow down. His words stayed with me all weekend. On Monday, I arranged a meeting with Daniel Brooks, an attorney recommended by one of our company's executives. I did not tell Emily where I was going. Daniel welcomed me into a quiet office lined with shelves full of legal books. After listening carefully, he folded his hands on his desk. "Do not accuse anyone without evidence," he said calmly. "Continue documenting dates, conversations, financial requests, and anything that seems inconsistent. Facts are always stronger than assumptions." That advice perfectly matched the approach I had already chosen. Before leaving his office, I asked another question. "Should I sign any new financial documents while I sort this out?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Not until you fully understand why they are necessary." Driving home, I felt something I had not experienced in months. It was not relief because I still did not know the whole truth. It was clarity. I finally had a plan that depended on patience instead of emotion. When I walked through the front door that evening, Emily greeted me with unusually exciting news. She had already scheduled an appointment with a financial planner for both of us later that week. "I thought it would help us prepare for everything ahead," she said brightly. I smiled politely and thanked her for arranging it. Inside, however, another question settled into my mind. Why was every step moving so quickly? Why did every conversation lead back to money, property, or legal paperwork instead of trust, healing, or honesty? After dinner, I carried the trash to the curb and stood quietly beneath the fading evening sky. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalk. A family across the street laughed while grilling hamburgers in their backyard. Life continued as though nothing had changed. Yet I could feel that the answers I was looking for were getting closer. Somewhere beneath the carefully prepared conversations, polished smiles, and neatly organized folders was a truth that could not remain hidden forever. I only needed to give it enough time to reveal itself. The appointment with the financial planner was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in a modern office overlooking downtown. Emily arrived, wearing a cream-colored blazer and carrying a leather portfolio I had never seen before. She looked confident, almost excited, while I quietly carried a simple notebook containing nothing more than dates, observations, and questions. The planner welcomed us warmly and began discussing savings goals, retirement planning, insurance, and estate documents. For the first 20 minutes, everything sounded perfectly ordinary. Then Emily gradually redirected the conversation. She mentioned that our family was growing and suggested that we should simplify ownership of our assets before the baby arrived. She spoke smoothly, as though the idea had occurred naturally during the meeting. The planner nodded politely and explained several possible options without recommending any specific course of action. I listened carefully without interrupting. When the planner asked whether I felt comfortable making immediate changes, I smiled and answered honestly. I prefer reviewing every document carefully before signing anything important. Emily laughed softly and squeezed my hand. "That is just Nathan. He likes to study every detail." She said it playfully, but I noticed the brief disappointment in her expression. The meeting ended without a single signature. As we walked back to the parking garage, Emily remained unusually quiet. Halfway to the car, she finally spoke. "I thought you trusted me." I looked at her calmly. Trust and careful planning are not opposites. She forced a smile, but the warmth in her voice had faded. Later that evening, after she went upstairs, I opened my notebook and added another entry to the timeline. Financial planning meeting. Suggested immediate asset changes. No documents signed. The pattern continued to repeat itself. Every important conversation somehow circled back to commitments that required my approval. The following Monday, an unexpected opportunity appeared. One of the project managers at my company mentioned that his cousin worked for the same travel agency Emily's group had used for their vacation. I did not ask anyone to violate privacy or reveal confidential information. Instead, I simply requested copies of the public itinerary that had been advertised for the resort package. Comparing those schedules with the photographs Emily and her coworkers had shared online revealed something unusual. Several pictures had been posted from locations that were not part of the organized group activities. The timestamps also suggested that smaller groups had separated from the main itinerary more than once. None of that proved wrongdoing, but it created another inconsistency that belonged on my growing timeline. That evening, Olivia called again. "I have been thinking about our last conversation," she said carefully. "Do you remember the man I mentioned seeing in the background of that photograph?" I told her I did. One of my coworkers recognized him. "His name is Ryan Mitchell. He owns a consulting company that sometimes works with Emily's firm." I thanked her and wrote the name into my notebook without adding any conclusions beside it. A name was not evidence. It was simply another fact waiting to be understood. 2 days later, Emily surprised me by announcing a dinner with several of her coworkers. She invited me to come along because, as she explained, everyone wanted to celebrate the exciting news. During dinner, I paid less attention to the conversations than to the small details around the table. Several coworkers congratulated us warmly, but one woman seemed genuinely confused when Emily mentioned the vacation. "I wish I could have stayed longer," the woman said. "I had to leave after the conference ended on Tuesday." Emily smiled quickly and changed the subject before anyone could ask more questions. I said nothing. On the drive home, she chatted cheerfully about work while I quietly replayed that single sentence. According to Emily, everyone had remained together for the entire week. According to her coworker, the conference ended several days earlier. Once again, another small inconsistency found its place beside all the others. When we reached home, Emily walked inside while I remained in the driveway for a few extra moments, looking at the notebook resting on the passenger seat. None of the individual pieces seemed powerful by themselves, yet together they were beginning to form a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. For the first time since this began, I felt that the truth was no longer hiding somewhere beyond my reach. It was slowly walking toward me, one quiet fact at a time. The following week, I stopped searching for dramatic discoveries and focused instead on ordinary details, because I had learned that ordinary details usually carried the greatest weight. Every evening after work, I updated my timeline with calm precision. Dates, conversations, appointments, financial discussions, travel records, and every inconsistency found its place on those pages. I never exaggerated a single fact because I wanted the truth to stand on its own. Emily, meanwhile, seemed increasingly impatient. She asked almost every day whether I had reviewed the financial documents she had prepared. She mentioned the larger house again and reminded me that interest rates could change if we waited too long. She also suggested opening a college savings account immediately. None of these ideas sounded unreasonable by themselves, yet together they created a sense of urgency that felt carefully constructed. One Friday evening, she invited her parents over for dinner without mentioning it to me beforehand. They congratulated us warmly and spoke enthusiastically about becoming grandparents. During dessert, Emily's father smiled across the table and said, "Nathan, now that you are starting the next chapter of your life, it is probably time to think about protecting your family's future. A man should make sure everything is secure." Emily glanced toward me with quiet expectation. I smiled politely and answered, "That is exactly why I never rush important decisions." The conversation became noticeably quieter for a moment before shifting to another subject. On Sunday afternoon, my attorney, Daniel Brooks, called to let me know he had completed a preliminary review of our financial records. We met the following morning in his office. He carefully organized several folders across his desk before speaking. "There is nothing illegal here," he said. "However, I noticed several proposed changes that would significantly increase your shared financial obligations if you approve them now." He looked directly at me. "You have done the right thing by waiting." Hearing those words strengthened my resolve. Patience was no longer just a personal choice. It had become my greatest protection. Later that week, another unexpected piece of information arrived. Marcus stopped by my office carrying a stack of construction reports. Before leaving, he hesitated. "Nathan, I almost forgot. One of our suppliers recognized someone in a photograph on my desk. He said Ryan Mitchell attends several business networking events in the city. Apparently, he and Emily have been seen talking together more than once over the past few months." Marcus immediately added that he was repeating casual observations rather than verified facts. I appreciated that honesty. Rumors alone meant nothing to me, but another connection had quietly appeared. That evening, I returned home earlier than usual. Emily was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open, quickly minimizing the screen as I walked inside. "I was looking at nursery ideas," she explained before I even asked a question. I simply nodded and began preparing dinner. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt revealing. People often rush to fill silence when they are worried about what the other person might already know. During dinner, she suddenly reached across the table and took my hand. "Nathan, do you still love me?" she asked softly. It was the first time she had asked me that question in months. I looked at her carefully before answering. Love has never been the hardest part. She waited for me to continue, but I did not. Some truths needed time before they could be spoken aloud. After she went upstairs that night, I opened my notebook once again. The timeline now stretched across several pages, connecting events that had once seemed completely unrelated. I studied every date one more time until my eyes stopped on a simple calendar entry from the week of her vacation. It was not a photograph, a receipt, or a financial document. It was a conference schedule I had nearly forgotten about. According to the official program, Emily's work conference had ended 3 full days before she returned home. She had told me the entire trip was required for work. The timeline quietly suggested otherwise. I closed the notebook, leaned back in my chair, and realized I was no longer trying to discover whether something had happened. I was trying to understand exactly what had happened during those missing 3 days, because deep inside I knew the answer was waiting there. The next morning I returned to Daniel Brooks's office carrying a folder that had become much heavier than its appearance suggested. Inside were printed timelines, bank statements, conference schedules, travel itineraries, notes from conversations, and every document I had collected over the previous several weeks. Daniel reviewed each page slowly without interrupting. Occasionally, he underlined a date or wrote a short note in the margin, but he never rushed ahead. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he looked at me with the calm expression I had come to appreciate. "You have done exactly what I hoped you would do," he said. "You stayed patient." He explained that while none of the documents alone proved the entire story, together they established a consistent sequence of events that deserved serious attention. More importantly, they demonstrated that I had not acted impulsively or emotionally. Every decision I had made had been measured and documented. Before I left, Daniel suggested one final step. Do not accuse her. Do not argue. Simply invite her to meet here next week under the pretense of reviewing your financial planning. If the facts are as consistent as they appear, the conversation will guide itself. I agreed immediately. For the first time since Emily returned home, I knew exactly what I was going to do. That evening, Emily seemed unusually cheerful. She ordered takeout from my favorite barbecue restaurant, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and suggested that we spend the weekend looking at model homes. I smiled politely and thanked her for dinner, but I declined the invitation. "I already have a meeting scheduled next Tuesday," I said. "It concerns our long-term planning." Her eyes brightened. "Perfect. Is it with the financial planner?" I nodded. "Something like that." She appeared, genuinely relieved, almost as though she believed I had finally decided to move forward with everything she had been proposing. The following days passed quietly. Emily became more affectionate than she had been in nearly a year. She left encouraging notes beside the coffee maker before I left for work. She texted me during lunch asking how my day was going. She even suggested taking a weekend trip together after the baby arrived. Listening to her speak, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer felt angry. Anger had been replaced by distance. I was no longer trying to save the marriage that existed in my memories. I was preparing to accept the reality standing in front of me. On Monday evening, Olivia stopped by unexpectedly with homemade apple pie, claiming she had baked too much. We sat on the back patio as the sun disappeared behind the trees. She looked at me carefully before asking, "Have you reached a decision?" I nodded slowly. "I have reached peace with whatever the truth turns out to be." She smiled sadly. "That sounds different." "It is," I answered. For weeks I was afraid of discovering the truth. Now I am only interested in living honestly. She reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder without saying another word. Sometimes the greatest comfort came from people who understood that silence did not always need to be filled. Tuesday finally arrived. I dressed for work as usual, placed my folder neatly inside a leather briefcase, and drove toward Daniel's office instead of downtown. Emily met me there exactly on time, carrying another portfolio filled with financial papers. She smiled confidently as we entered the reception area together. "I am glad you finally agreed to do this," she whispered. "Once we finish today, everything will be so much easier." I looked at her and returned a polite smile. "Yes," I said quietly. "Everything is about to become much clearer." A few moments later, Daniel opened the conference room door and invited us inside. The polished wooden table was spotless except for 3 glasses of water and a single empty folder waiting in the center. Emily sat down with complete confidence, believing she was attending one final planning meeting before the next chapter of our lives began. She had no idea that every quiet decision I had made over the previous weeks had led to this room, and that before either of us walked back through those doors, the future she imagined would no longer exist. Daniel waited until the conference room door closed before speaking. His voice was calm and professional. "Thank you both for coming. Nathan asked me to help review several important matters before any financial decisions are made." Emily smiled politely and placed her portfolio on the table. "That is exactly what we wanted," she replied. "We are trying to prepare for our family's future." Daniel nodded without reacting. "That is always a wise goal." I quietly opened my briefcase and removed the folder that had occupied so many evenings at my kitchen table. Every page inside represented patience instead of suspicion, facts instead of accusations. Emily noticed the thickness of the folder and glanced at me with mild curiosity. "What is all of that?" she asked. "Just a timeline," I answered. Daniel invited me to begin wherever I felt comfortable. I slid the first page across the table. It contained nothing except dates. The day Emily told me she needed space. The weekend trip we canceled. The counseling appointment that never happened. The conference announcement. The departure date for Florida. The official conference schedule. The return flight. The pregnancy announcement. No opinions appeared anywhere on the page. Only verified events. Emily looked down briefly before folding her hands together. "I do not understand what this proves," she said. "Nothing by itself," I replied calmly. "That is why there is more." I placed another document beside the first. It was the public conference agenda showing the event concluded 3 days before her scheduled return home. Daniel allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before asking a simple question. "Emily, could you explain where you stayed during those additional 3 days?" She hesitated before answering. "Everyone decided to extend the vacation together." I nodded once and reached for another page. "One of your coworkers told a different story. She left when the conference ended. She believed several people made separate plans afterward." Emily shifted slightly in her chair. "She must have been mistaken." I did not argue. I simply placed another document on the table. It contained timestamps from publicly shared photographs taken throughout the trip. Several images placed Emily in locations that did not match the organized itinerary she had previously described. Again, I offered no conclusions. Daniel studied the pages quietly before sliding them back into the center of the table. "These documents do not accuse anyone," he said. "They simply establish inconsistencies that deserve honest explanations." Emily crossed her arms for the first time since entering the room. "You have been investigating me?" she asked. "No," I answered. "I have been trying to understand what happened." She looked at me for several long seconds before forcing a faint smile. "Nathan, this is unnecessary. We should be focusing on the baby instead of travel schedules." I met her eyes without raising my voice. "That is exactly why the timeline matters." I opened the final section of the folder. Inside were notes documenting every conversation about immediate financial changes, new property purchases, beneficiary updates, and requests for signatures made after she returned home. Arranged chronologically, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Daniel looked toward Emily. "Can you explain why every major financial proposal began only after your return?" Emily answered quickly. "We were planning for our future." Daniel nodded politely. "That may be true. However, Mr. Carter also had every right to review those decisions carefully before making legal commitments." The room became remarkably quiet. No one argued. No one raised a voice. The silence itself carried more weight than any dramatic confrontation could have. Emily finally looked directly at me. "What are you really trying to say?" she asked softly. I closed the folder and rested both hands on the table. "I am saying that trust cannot survive where the truth keeps changing." Daniel slowly placed a single document in front of me. It was the petition for dissolution of our marriage, prepared but unsigned until that moment. Emily stared at the first page, then back at me, the confidence she carried into the meeting fading into quiet disbelief. She had expected another financial discussion. Instead, she was looking at the one decision I had delayed until every important question had been answered for myself. Emily looked at the document for what felt like an eternity without touching it. The confidence that had carried her into Daniel's office had quietly disappeared. She finally raised her eyes toward me, searching for the hesitation she had expected to find. Instead, she found something else. Acceptance. I was no longer trying to convince her of anything. I was no longer asking questions. I had reached the point where answers mattered less than honesty. "You are really ending this?" she asked in a voice that was almost a whisper. I nodded once. "Yes." She shook her head slowly. "After everything we built together?" I looked down at the timeline resting beside the legal documents. What we built depended on trust. Once that disappeared, the rest became a house without a foundation. Daniel remained silent, allowing both of us the space to speak without interruption. Emily looked toward him as though hoping he would somehow change the direction of the conversation, but he simply folded his hands and waited. After several long moments, she pushed her portfolio aside and leaned back in her chair. "I never thought you would do this," she admitted quietly. "I know," I answered. "That is why I waited until I was certain." There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations, no attempt to embarrass one another. The room remained remarkably calm because the hardest decisions often arrive without raised voices. Daniel carefully explained the next legal steps, reminding both of us that the process would move forward respectfully and according to the law. I listened carefully, signed the petition, and handed the pen back across the table. The sound of the paper sliding into the folder was almost imperceptible, yet it marked the end of a chapter that had lasted nearly a decade. When the meeting concluded, Emily gathered her belongings slowly. She paused beside the conference room door and turned toward me one final time. "Do you hate me?" she asked. I thought about the question longer than she probably expected. "No," I said honestly. "Hate keeps people connected to the past. I am choosing something different." She lowered her eyes, nodded faintly, and walked out without another word. I remained seated for another minute before thanking Daniel for his patience and professionalism throughout the process. As I stepped outside, a cool breeze moved through the city streets. For the first time in months, I noticed how quiet my own thoughts had become. There were still difficult conversations ahead. There would be paperwork, practical decisions, and emotional adjustments. None of those realities frightened me anymore because uncertainty had finally been replaced by clarity. During the following weeks, I moved into a smaller townhouse only 15 minutes from my office. The place was modest compared to the home I had left behind, but every room felt peaceful. There were no whispered conversations behind closed doors, no unanswered questions lingering in the hallway, and no pressure to ignore what my instincts had been trying to tell me for months. Olivia visited often, usually bringing homemade desserts that were far too large for two people. Marcus helped me assemble new furniture one Saturday morning, joking that construction projects were much easier than reading instruction manuals. Their quiet support reminded me that real loyalty rarely announced itself with grand speeches. It simply showed up when you needed it most. One evening, I found the notebook that had started everything. I turned slowly through each page, reading the careful notes I had written during so many sleepless nights. Then I closed it, placed it inside a storage box, and carried it into the garage. Some records deserve to be kept, not because they preserve pain, but because they remind us how easily truth can be overlooked when hope speaks louder than facts. Looking back now, I do not believe patience made me weak. It gave me the time to separate emotion from evidence and fear from reality. I learned that trust should never require blindness. Love should never demand the sacrifice of self-respect, and peace sometimes begins with the quiet courage to walk away from a life that no longer reflects the values you choose to live by. On the day I locked the front door of my new home for the very first time, I realized I had not won a battle against another person. I had simply reclaimed the honesty I owed myself, and that turned out to be the greatest victory of all.